And now, Kellie, your turn.
Andrew Feinstein, a former South African politician, has studied the arms trade for in excess of 17 years. And he referred to weapons industry profits being measured in billions and costs being measured in lives. What was interesting about what he was saying is that there are very few arms transactions that do not involve some illegality, which alludes to what Professor Rees was saying. He also mentions national security imposed secrecy, and I would add, in the case of Australia, commercial in confidence and FOI exemptions in terms of actually investigating where money goes, the players involved, who's accountable, and so forth. And I think struggle and activism must be supported by facts, investigations throughout public discourse. And at the moment, you will notice that Christopher Pyne appears to be bedding down the infrastructure around the proposal to increase defence exports by $200 billion over the next decade, which, if you put into perspective, at the moment there are calls for a $50 increase to the New Start allowance, which would equate to a $3 billion increase to the budget bottom line. So we've got $200 billion over the next decade on military expenditure and exports versus $3 billion for the poorest of the poor. We all would be familiar today with the figures released by Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which refers to the $1.739 billion being spent on its military expenditure, which equates to, on my estimates, for a population of about 7.6 billion, global population, about $225 per man, woman, child on the planet. If we look at our contribution of $200 billion over the next decade, that equates to $8,288 per man, woman and child in this country. What is curious about the defence export strategy is that it involves companies that are, well, they're really subsidiaries of multinationals. So they are here and they are under licence arrangements, so profits obviously go offshore. So it's generating limited technological expertise and jobs. So there is an argument put forth, and it was put forth earlier this year by the Prime Minister himself when he said, but it all comes down to this: Australian jobs, 21st century jobs, high-tech, cutting-edge jobs that will ensure we continue to deliver on jobs growth that we saw last year, the highest since records began. It was interesting that the Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs released a study last year in America, which said, look, dollar for dollar, if costs is the objective, clearly $1 million spent on education creates more jobs than investing that in military. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you spend your money on military, there are capital investments to be made. You may employ a small group of people, but it's not as labour intensive as industries like education, which requires teachers and people to drive school buses and staff and so forth. So if you're looking at the creation of jobs, expenditure on military is a far inferior spend if that is the intention of this government. But the other side of military expenditure is the trade-offs, which is what we're talking about. It's the costs to innocent civilians. It's the trade-off for, are we talking about deficit spending if we're going to be spending $200 billion? Will there be interest on that? Will it affect a return to a budget surplus? All these things that politicians seem to constantly be obsessed by. And if we increase our expenditure on military, which is supposed to be 2% of GDP by 2021, where will that money be taken from? Will it be taken from another sector? So will it come from disability, or will it come from education and so forth, which is probably what we are likely to see unfold. Target markets. We seem to be targeting our defence expenditure or our defence exports to, according to Maurice Payne and Christopher Pyne, to the United States, Canada, the UK and New Zealand. But added onto that list, of course, was Europe and beyond places like Asia and the Middle East. And I don't have to tell this audience what's unfolding in the Middle East, Yemen, Palestine, and various other places in terms of the involvement, for instance, recently of an American bomb being dropped by Saudi Arabia on a wedding party in Yemen. But there was a concession, or it wasn't even a concession, there was an add-on by Christopher Pyne that obviously no equipment or platforms will be sold to any country unless the most stringent requirements are put in place through the permits process. That's not being tested, and according to my research, I'm currently trying to work out, we know that we've granted 16 military licenses to Saudi Arabia. We don't know what that equipment was, how it is to be used. It's protected by commercial in confidence. Saudi Arabia is not, it's not the subject of a UN Security Council resolution, and it's not, we haven't issued any autonomous sanctions on Saudi Arabia or Israel or the United Arab Emirates and so forth. So there are loopholes in these assurances that we're getting from politicians, which must be tested by people like yourselves, journalists asking the right questions, issuing FOIs, seeing how far that will take you. At the moment, I'm trying to work out whether in fact we had legal advice about the exports to Saudi Arabia, and it's not looking good in terms of whether we did have that advice. We're just waiting for DFAT to get back to us about whether that advice was provided. I could go on, but I'll throw it over to questions, but we can explore more detail.
Thank you, Kellie. So, over to you if there are questions.
Can I just make a comment about Kellie's last valuable point? I mean, the evidence seems to me to be that there's hardly any difference between the CEOs of the arms industry companies and the political culture